My name is Wayne Callahan. I'm 81 years old, and I live alone in a small ranch house in the suburbs of Milwaukee. My days begin early, not because I have anywhere urgent to be, but because sleep has become a finicky guest in my old age, coming late and leaving early without warning. The mornings are quiet, just the way I like them, filled with the low rumble of my coffee maker, the rustle of newspapers on the kitchen table, and the familiar creaks of a house that has settled into old age right alongside me. I sit by the window in my worn recliner, sipping slowly from a chipped ceramic mug that once belonged to my late wife, Gloria. She passed away 6 years ago, and though time has blurred the sharpest edges of that loss, there are days when I still reach for her voice in the silence, forgetting for a moment that she's no longer there to answer. I used to be a high school math teacher, 38 years in the same building, the same room, chalk in hand and numbers on the board. My students went on to be engineers, accountants, grocery clerks, mothers and fathers. Some of them still send me Christmas cards, though most have drifted into the anonymous tide of the world as they should. I was never the kind of teacher students adored, but they respected me. I held my classroom like a courtroom. Firm but fair, organized but never cruel. I believed in the power of logic and truth, the beauty of a well-solved problem. My wife used to tease that I treated equations more tenderly than I did my own emotions. She wasn't wrong. I was a provider, a planner, a man who believed that if you followed the rules and kept your books balanced, life would do the same in return. That belief seems naive now. Gloria and I had one son, Brian. He was bright, athletic, always on the move. More like his mother than me. He grew up, got married, and gave us one grandson, Trevor. For a while, we were a tight little family unit. Sunday dinners, birthday cakes, school plays, the whole picture book set. But somewhere between Trevor's 8th and 13th birthday, the visits grew less frequent. Brian's job got busier, their vacations more exclusive. "You understand, Dad, things are just hectic right now," Brian would say. I always said I did because what else can you say to your only child when he's slipping away? You don't beg. You wait. You hope that time will fold back toward closeness, that the boy who once held your hand in the parking lot will remember how it felt to belong to someone. After Gloria died, I gave up on expecting anyone to check in on me regularly. I learned to live with the slow crawl of empty hours. I kept the house clean, even though there was no one to admire the effort. I paid the bills on time, mowed the lawn in straight lines, and drove to the grocery store every Friday at 9. The world around me started moving faster, more alien, more digital, and I let it pass. I had my routines, and they had me. I wasn't lonely in the dramatic sense. I didn't cry into soup bowls or talk to framed photographs, but I carried a sort of static sadness, like an old television that stays on even after the picture fades. Trevor came around less and less. The boy I once taught to ride a bike, the one who used to build Lego castles on my living room floor while Gloria baked cookies in the kitchen, had become a stranger. He turned 17 last month, and I hadn't seen him in almost a year. When Brian called and asked if Trevor could stay with me for a weekend, just to give us a little breathing room, I agreed without hesitation. I told myself it was a good thing, a chance to reconnect, a chance to show him who I was beyond the aging figure in faded family photos. I bought his favorite snacks, vacuumed the guest room, and even looked up a few things about the latest video games so I wouldn't sound like a complete fossil. But beneath the preparation was a knot of anxiety I couldn't untangle. I had seen glimpses of the new Trevor, sarcastic, impatient, eyes glued to screens, and I feared what those glimpses might become up close. I didn't want to admit that I was nervous about spending time with my own grandson. That would have been too shameful, too vulnerable. Instead, I told myself stories. Maybe he was just going through a phase. Maybe he'd mellow out away from his parents. Maybe, just maybe, the quiet dignity of this house, the same house his father grew up in, would awaken something gentle in him. That Friday afternoon, when his mother dropped him off, I stood on the porch in my best slacks and an ironed shirt. The one Gloria used to say brought out the blue in my eyes. Trevor barely looked up from his phone. "Hey," he muttered, walking past me into the house. His mother waved from the car. "Thanks, Dad." "He's just tired. Long week." Then she was gone. I turned to find Trevor already in the living room, slumped on the couch, shoes still on, scrolling through his phone like the world outside, it didn't exist. "Hungry?" I asked. "I made your favorite, spaghetti and meatballs." He grunted, still staring at the screen. "Maybe later." I stood there a moment longer, unsure whether to sit down or just disappear. I ended up doing both, shuffling into the kitchen and pretending to rearrange the silverware drawer just to have something to do. That night, he didn't eat dinner. He stayed up until 2 a.m. playing something on his laptop, the noises echoing through the thin walls. When I gently asked him to turn it down, he said, "It's not like you have work tomorrow or anything." "Chill out, Grandpa." I went back to bed, pulling the covers up over my ears, the way I used to when I was a boy afraid of thunderstorms. The next morning I made pancakes the way Gloria used to make them, with buttermilk and a pinch of cinnamon. He didn't touch them. "I don't eat carbs," he said, rolling his eyes. "No offense, but this whole house smells like retirement." I laughed softly, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. By the time we left for the grocery store, I had stopped trying to talk much. It felt like every word I said was either ignored or deflected with a smirk. Still, I tried. I wanted him to see the man behind the cardigan, behind the hearing aids, and the liver spots. I wanted him to remember that I taught hundreds of kids his age to make sense of chaos through numbers. At the checkout counter, I was counting bills and coins, deliberately, out of habit. The way I always do, math isn't a reflex anymore. It's a ritual, one of the last threads tying me to who I used to be. I had just handed the cashier a 10 when I heard Trevor behind me snort and say under his breath, "Old man can't even count change." Something in me stopped. Not my heart, not my mind, but something softer, something unnameable that lives behind the ribs and keeps you tethered to hope. The cashier looked embarrassed. I smiled politely, finished the transaction, and we walked out in silence. The groceries felt heavier than usual, and so did my chest. That was the moment I knew this weekend wasn't about reconnecting. It wasn't about healing or mending. It was about reckoning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the same checkbook I'd used for over 40 years. The numbers lined up neatly, each column balanced, each cent accounted for. I thought about my savings, my modest pension, the house with its creaky stairs and quiet corners. I thought about all I had built, not just with dollars, but with decades of patience, labor, and silent sacrifice. I had never spoken loudly about what I'd done for my family. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe silence had made me invisible. But I wasn't invisible. Not yet. And I still knew how to count every dollar, every betrayal, every time they looked through me like I was already gone. And this time I'd let them hear me count out loud. The next morning arrived cloaked in the soft, reluctant light of early autumn. The kind of morning that should have been peaceful, slow, reverent, quiet. But the house, though still structurally sound, felt suddenly full of friction. I moved through the rooms like a guest in my own life, careful not to disturb Trevor, who had taken over the living room with the ease and assumption of someone who believed the space was his by default. His laptop was left open on the coffee table, next to a pile of empty snack wrappers and his shoes were thrown off somewhere between the hallway and the armchair where he had eventually fallen asleep watching loud, chaotic videos. I made coffee and drank it alone at the kitchen table, listening to the distant hum of online voices from his computer speakers. My hands felt heavier than usual as I folded the newspaper and reached for my pill organizer. I didn't like this feeling, this growing sensation that I was being observed not with love or patience, but with disdain. I had hoped that Trevor's visit might spark something human between us, but the boy who had once fallen asleep on my shoulder while watching baseball had become someone else entirely. Closed off, sarcastic, emotionally threadbare. By noon he was awake, hungry, and loud. He clattered around the kitchen searching for something edible and tossed aside my hard-boiled eggs and chicken salad as if I were offering him compost. "Don't you have, actual food?" he asked, pulling open cabinet after cabinet with the desperation of someone on the brink of starvation. I pointed to the bread, the deli meat, the cheddar slices, all neatly arranged. He sighed. "Never mind. I'll order something." He took out his phone and within seconds was tapping away at some delivery app. He didn't ask me if I wanted anything, didn't consider that perhaps I might want to sit and eat with him. I sat there, nursing a second cup of coffee that had long gone lukewarm, trying to find a way to reach him. "You know," I began cautiously, "your father used to love it when your grandmother made her chicken salad. He said it tasted better than anything you could get at a restaurant." Trevor didn't look up. "That's because Dad never had Postmates." The food arrived 20 minutes later, a greasy burger with triple bacon and fries soaked in oil. He sat on the couch with his laptop open on one knee and the burger on the other, eyes glued to the screen while his fingers made short work of the meal. Occasionally, he'd snort at something on the screen or mutter a quick reply to whoever he was messaging. I wondered if he even remembered my name. That evening, I suggested we take a walk around the neighborhood. The trees were beginning to turn, and I thought maybe the crisp air and the shifting colors might spark some kind of conversation. He groaned. "A walk? Seriously?" I tried to smile. "It's not far, just to the park and back. You could use the fresh air." He muttered something about old people and their obsession with walks, but eventually agreed, dragging his feet the whole way, like I'd sentenced him to hard labor. At the park, we sat on a bench near the pond, and for a moment it almost felt like something real could happen. I watched the ducks paddle through the reflection of a pale orange sky. "Your dad used to fish here when he was about your age," I said. "He caught a catfish once so big we had to put it in a bucket with the lid halfway open." Trevor glanced up from his phone for half a second. "Cool story." Then, just as quickly, his eyes dropped back to the screen. "You don't remember stuff wrong now, do you?" he added. "Like memory loss and stuff?" I turned to look at him more fully. "No," I said quietly. "I remember everything just fine." He shrugged. "It's just, Dad said sometimes people your age start, forgetting things, getting confused, losing track of money and stuff. That true for you?" The question felt less like curiosity and more like a subtle probe, like a pick testing the rot beneath a wooden beam. I didn't answer right away. I let the words hang in the air between us, watching how he looked at me, not with affection or concern, but with calculated distance. "I remember enough to know when someone is trying to test me," I said finally. He blinked, as if surprised I'd called him out. "Relax. I'm just asking." The walk home was quiet. I didn't say another word, and neither did he. I thought about what he said, about forgetting things, and realized the seed had already been planted. Maybe not by Trevor alone, but somewhere, somehow. The idea that I was no longer capable had taken root in their minds, Or maybe it was just a story they wanted to believe because it made their own behavior easier to justify. Either way, something had shifted. Later that night, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. My skin sagged in places it hadn't before. My eyes looked tired, watery, ringed with age. But there was something else in them too, something fierce and ancient and awake. I rinsed my mouth and leaned in closer. "You're still here?" I whispered. "And you know exactly what's going on." The next morning, Trevor asked if we could swing by the bank. He needed to move some money around, he said casually, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "Mom said you still use checks and stuff," he added. "That's like ancient. You don't use online banking?" "I like paper," I replied, holding his gaze. "Just saying, not super secure. Easy to forget stuff, passwords, codes, whatever. Maybe I could help you set something up. Make things easier." "I prefer it the way it is," I said simply. He nodded, then smirked. "Okay, Grandpa. Don't bite my head off." He spent most of that day upstairs, claiming he had schoolwork. I heard him pacing, heard the creak of the floorboards and the rhythmic clacking of a keyboard. Once, when I passed the door, I saw it open a crack and glimpsed him leaning over my file cabinet. The one in my study. The one I thought I had locked. I didn't say anything then. I just kept walking. That evening, we went to the grocery store again. Just a quick trip, I told him. I needed eggs and milk. At the register, I fumbled with my wallet trying to find exact change. The coins were stiff in my fingers, my joints aching with a subtle but persistent reminder of age. Trevor stood behind me, sighing impatiently. "Just use a card," he muttered. "Seriously, this is pathetic." I looked up at the cashier, who was trying not to react, trying to stay polite. I said nothing, finished the transaction, and walked toward the exit. Outside, as we loaded the bags into the trunk, Trevor said, "No offense, but you're kind of losing it. I mean, I could help. Like manage stuff for you, finances and whatever. It's not safe for you to be handling all this alone anymore." I closed the trunk slowly and looked him in the eye. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'm still quite capable." He didn't answer, just got into the car, slamming the door a little harder than necessary. On the drive home, he stared out the window, earbuds in, already gone. That night, after he had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my checkbook and a stack of folders. I opened each one slowly, methodically. Bank statements, insurance papers, a copy of my will. I made some notes on a yellow pad. Careful, deliberate notes. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was colder, older, more rooted than anger. It was the quiet certainty of a man who had seen the end of too many stories not to recognize the beginning of one. And this one had a very particular ending in mind. The following day began without ceremony. I awoke to the same silence that had become so familiar over the past years, only now it felt more charged, like the calm before a storm that you can feel in your bones long before you see clouds gather. I could hear Trevor in the guest room, talking on his phone with the exaggerated confidence of a young man who believed the world owed him something simply because he was born into it. His voice was muffled but sharp, tinged with that casual arrogance that made me feel like an unwanted exhibit in a museum of family history. I stood in the hallway for a few moments, listening. He was laughing. "Yeah, he's totally out of it," he said, his voice lowered, but not low enough. "Barely knows what day it is." I think he called the toaster the microwave. It's kind of sad I stepped back before I heard more. My hand tightened around the edge of the door frame. I hadn't said anything of the sort. I hadn't confused anything. That wasn't forgetfulness. He was lying. By the time I made it into the kitchen, Trevor was already there, pouring himself a glass of juice without asking. He looked at me, offered a quick, toothless smile, and said, Morning, Grandpa. Sleep okay? You were kind of restless last night. Heard you walking around, I nodded, refusing to match his fake brightness. I like to think, I said simply, sometimes it's easier to do that while moving. He took a long sip and leaned against the counter. I've been thinking, too, about the future. School, money, life. It's crazy how expensive everything is. I waited. He was building towards something. I could feel it. College is a joke now. Tuition's insane. And Dad says we probably won't get much financial aid because technically we have assets. Or whatever. Not like liquid cash, just property, retirement accounts. Stuff that doesn't help me now. He was watching me closely, gauging my response. I gave him nothing. So, he continued, I was thinking, you know how some people help their grandkids get a head start? Like contribute to college or help with a car? Not that you have to, obviously. I just thought maybe we could talk about it. You've always been good with money, right? I took a deep breath. I've always tried to be fair and thoughtful. Exactly, he said, picking up the cue. So maybe you'd want to help out now while you can actually see the results? While you're still, well, Around there it was. I stared at him, not speaking, and he began to fidget. I mean, it's not like I'm asking for much. Just a little start, something small, a few thousand. Maybe co-sign something? He laughed awkwardly. It's not like I'm going to rob you or anything. But that was exactly what he was doing, just in a more polite, socially acceptable form. Later that afternoon, he made a show of being helpful. He offered to help bring down the boxes from the attic, though I hadn't asked for any help. Figured we could get rid of some of this old junk, he said. No point keeping all this stuff around if you're going to move into a smaller place soon anyway. I blinked. I'm not moving anywhere, he laughed again. No, I know. Just saying. Eventually. You might want something easier, No stairs, less maintenance. Everyone does it. That night after dinner, he brought up the will. I was just curious, he said, picking at the edge of his placemat. Do you have stuff written down? In case something happens? Like for the house and everything, I looked at him slowly. Yes. He waited for more, but I didn't offer it. Cool, he said. And you've got it somewhere safe, right? Like a lawyer or a safety deposit box or something? Something like that, I said. The next morning, he was up earlier than usual. I heard movement in my study. When I walked in, he was sitting at my desk, pretending to read an old newspaper. The drawer beside him was open. Looking for the comics? I asked, my voice even. He jumped. Oh, no. Just saw the paper and got curious. Didn't mean to snoop or anything. I didn't respond. I just walked over and slowly closed the drawer. Later that afternoon, while he was taking a nap, I checked the drawer myself. Some of the files had been moved. My tax returns, bank statements, copies of insurance policies, all handled. Not missing, just disturbed. Like someone had sifted through them in a hurry. That evening, I tested him. I left my wallet on the hallway table while I stepped outside to take the trash out. When I came back, the wallet had shifted slightly. Nothing was missing, but I could tell it had been opened. The flap didn't lie flat anymore. I said nothing. I wanted to be sure. The next day, I told him we needed to run an errand together. Something about notarizing a form at the bank. He groaned, but came along. While we were waiting in line, I casually asked him what he knew about power of attorney. I said lightly, some people sign over their finances when they get older. Makes it easier. His eyes lit up, just a flash. But it was there. Yeah, he said. I've heard about that. Smart move. You thinking about doing that? Just a thought, I replied. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, remembering things I had spent years trying to forget. My own father's decline, the way my siblings had circled like vultures around his modest estate, how dignity can be sliced away piece by piece by those who claim to love you. I had sworn never to become bitter, never to assume the worst of family. But now, with each passing hour, my grandson was teaching me that cynicism wasn't always born of trauma. It could be born of observation. The final blow came on Sunday. We had gone out again. For groceries, a walk, a drive through the old part of town where I used to take Brian when he was Trevor's age. I was telling a story, something about the hardware store that used to sit on the corner, when Trevor cut me off. "You've told me this already." Twice I stopped speaking. He sighed. "No offense, Grandpa, but your memory's kind of, slipping. You repeat stuff. You mix up names. You couldn't count change yesterday. Like, it's fine. You're old. But maybe it's time to let someone else step in." He looked at me with something that was almost pity, but not quite. It was colder than pity. It was assessment, calculation. That night, I found a message on my voicemail. It was from Brian. "Hey, Dad. Trevor says you've been a little confused lately. Nothing to worry about. I'm sure it's normal. But maybe we should talk soon. About the house, about making things easier for you. No pressure." I sat down on the stairs and listened to the message 3 times. My hand was trembling, but not from age, from something else, something deeper. A clarity that struck like lightning. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were trying to make it happen faster, and they thought I wouldn't notice. They were wrong. That night I waited until the house was completely still. The hallway light cast a long, dim ribbon across the floor, and for a while I simply stood in the shadows of my own home, listening. Trevor's door was shut. The glow of his laptop filtered out beneath the frame. I could hear the soft clack of keys, a pause, then the gentle buzz of a notification. I waited until it stopped. Then I moved quietly back to my room, sat at my desk, and opened the locked box I hadn't touched since Gloria died. Inside were my original banking documents, my retirement statements, a sealed envelope containing my will, and a small, leather-bound notebook I'd once used to track expenses and goals when we were newly married. I opened it now, ran my fingers over the faded pages, and remembered the dreams we had carefully folded into each entry. A home with a garden, a child's college fund, a trip to Montana we never took. Nothing extravagant, just clean hopes, simple, honest things. I turned to a blank page. The notebook still had weight, still had purpose. I began to write. I wrote down everything that had happened in the past few days, not in emotion, but in facts. The way I used to record data when I was teaching. The comments Trevor had made, the questions he'd asked about my accounts, the way the files had been disturbed. I detailed the shift in tone during our conversations, the probing curiosity dressed up as concern. I noted the voicemail from Brian, verbatim. I wasn't writing out of fear or paranoia. I was writing because something inside me had reawakened, something methodical and sharp. The part of me that used to solve problems others couldn't see. The part of me they thought was gone. The next morning I went to the bank. I didn't tell Trevor. I left early under the guise of going to the grocery store. The woman at the branch, Melissa, had known me for years. She called me Mr. Callahan, even though I'd told her a dozen times to call me Wayne. I sat down across from her and asked to review my accounts. She looked concerned, but nodded. "Is something wrong, Mr. Callahan?" "Not yet," I said, "but I'd like to make sure it stays that way." She pulled up the information. I verified the balances, the recent transactions. Everything seemed normal, until I asked for access logs. "Who has permissions on these accounts?" I asked. She scrolled. "Just you, sir." I nodded, pretending to be reassured, though something in me stayed taut. "I'd like to remove online access for now. I prefer paper statements. Also, no account changes without in-person verification." She hesitated, then nodded. "Understood. I'll put the restriction in place." I thanked her, took my printed statements, and walked out into the cold sunlight feeling something close to steady. At home, Trevor was sitting on the porch, hoodie up, scrolling through his phone. He looked up. "You were gone a while." "I took the scenic route," I said. "Needed to clear my head." He nodded. "Cool." Later that day, I watched as he hovered around my study again. "Can I use the printer?" he asked. "I need to print something for school." I nodded. "Of course. Just don't go rearranging my files again." He froze. "I didn't—" "It's all right," I said. "Just ask next time." That night, I received a second voicemail from Brian. "Hey, Dad. Just checking in again. Trevor said you've been sort of forgetful. Maybe it's nothing, but we were wondering if it might be time to discuss, support. In case things get worse. Maybe a power of attorney setup. Just to help, I listened to the message in the dark, holding the receiver to my ear for a long time after it ended. Not because I hadn't expected it, but because I finally understood the timeline. They were moving faster than I thought. The seed had already been planted. Trevor had watered it with whispers. And now Brian was tending it carefully, as if grooming a future that didn't belong to him. They weren't asking for permission. They were preparing to take over. I spent the next day in preparation. I made copies of all my documents, legal, medical, financial. I placed them in labeled folders, scanned them to an encrypted flash drive, and stored the original versions at the bottom of a sealed box beneath my bed. I contacted my attorney, a quiet man named Halstead, who had handled Gloria's estate. I scheduled a meeting, told him it was urgent but private. The morning of our meeting, I told Trevor I was going to the pharmacy. He barely looked up. "Cool. Grab me something for my throat, would you?" "Think I'm getting a cold?" I said I would. At the lawyer's office, I laid everything out. Halstead listened patiently, his eyebrows climbing higher with each sentence. "You believe your grandson and son are attempting to present you as incompetent?" "Not believe," I said. "I'm watching it happen." He folded his hands. "We can preempt this. We'll draft a notarized declaration of mental fitness. You'll get 2 independent medical evaluations. We'll file a statement with your financial institutions to block external influence. And if you'd like, we can prepare a letter revoking any potential claims of power of attorney, unless initiated by you in writing." "Do it," I said. By the end of the meeting, the shape of the defense was in place, but it no longer felt like a defense. It felt like strategy. I wasn't just trying to protect myself. I was drawing lines in the sand. Back at home, I found Trevor sitting in my chair, the one Gloria used to read in. He looked up, eyes half-lidded. "Hey, so I talked to Dad. He says maybe we should help you with bills and stuff. Said you might be getting overwhelmed. We could, simplify things. Help you downsize?" I set the bag from the pharmacy on the table and looked at him. "Do I look overwhelmed to you?" He opened his mouth, closed it. I shook my head slowly. "You should pack. I think it's time you went home." His expression shifted, confused, and then panicked. "What? Why?" "Because this house still belongs to me, and while I'm still breathing, I decide who stays in it." He stood up, defensive. "I was just trying to help." "No," I said, my voice low and steady. "You were trying to replace me." but I'm not finished yet. And I don't intend to go quietly. The morning began with a fragility I could taste in the air, as though the house itself held its breath in anticipation of confrontation. I had arranged my routine deliberately: coffee brewed, breakfast set, doors locked, papers secured, anticipating what the day might bring. When Trevor finally emerged, bleary-eyed and sullen, I could already feel the shift, the tectonic rumble beneath the polite veneer of a family visit. He sauntered into the kitchen with that same studied casualness, skin pale from the screen's glow, expression taut and guarded. He didn't acknowledge my presence at first, eyes flitting to the clock, as if measuring how long he could delay engagement. We ate breakfast in silence, the only sounds the scrape of the spoon against the cereal bowl, and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I tried to speak, to offer some warmth, but the words refused to rise. Instead, I watched him across the table, a nephew of perception, whispering that everything had changed. Then, the words came. Not gentle, not indirect, but sharp, precise, loaded with accusation. "Grandpa, I think you're losing it. Yesterday at the store, I heard you asking for help counting change." Hard to watch, the sentence landed like a hammer stroke. It wasn't a concern. It was an indictment. I felt the blood drain from my face, a simmering rage, trying to quell the tremor at the edge of my vision. But I breathed slowly, tight-lipped, steady. I let the accusation hang between us like a curtain pulled too quickly. It was the line drawn, and now everything had changed. Trevor smirked, as if he'd broken the final barrier. He tapped his phone screen, looked up with that dangerous glint, then turned the device towards me. On the screen were bank balances, account details, recent deposits, numbers that were mine, private, weaponized. I recognized the formatting. My online statement, accessed sooner than the bank would allow. I slid my gaze away, steadying myself. I had counted the balances before stepping out, made sure everything was correct. That screen was proof that someone had rummaged. He leaned back, palms flat on the table. "Just trying to help," he said. But I could taste the contempt behind the words, see the entitlement burning in his eyes. I stood. The chair scraped. "No help needed," I said quietly, measuredly, the words heavy. "I handle things just fine." He scoffed. "Sure, Grandpa." I walked from the table without another word, the house echoing with silent accusation. Upstairs, I retrieved the sealed box and the notebook. My record of facts, not emotions. I took the pen and wrote once more, underlining the betrayal in each deliberate stroke. I recorded what he said, how he insinuated, how he unraveled the dignity I'd carried for 81 years. Throughout the day, Trevor escalated. At lunch, he made a face as I offered soup. "You know, you're not going to eat all that, right? You're on a diet, right?" I paid no mind. Later, he mocked the tone of my voice when I tried to make a phone call. He shadowed my every move with an impatient impatience, as though my life was an irritation to be tolerated. When I slid a note under his bedroom door, asking him to join me in the living room for a story, he refused. Said story was about his father's childhood, how Brian learned to tie his shoes, the day he spilled soup all over the porch and we laughed it off. Things Trevor never had. "Save it," he muttered. "I'm tired of the nostalgia." That night he called his mother. I could hear through the thin walls. "He's so weird, Mom." He's acting off, claustrophobic. Hard to be around. His tone wasn't anger, it was disgust. The next morning, Brian arrived without warning. He didn't walk in with concern. He walked in with calculation. He shook my hand awkwardly, too firm, too fast, and asked how I felt. I told him fine. He nodded and dropped the subject like a stone into water. They spent that afternoon speaking in quiet tones I couldn't catch. I watched them from the kitchen doorway, their silhouettes stiff and conspiratorial. Trevor whispered, Brian nodded, and the house seemed to shrink. When dinner time came, my appetite was gone. I set a plate before Trevor, who looked at it as though it were an obstacle. He frowned, pushed it aside, and said, "You know, maybe living alone isn't the best idea. Maybe you'd be happier somewhere smaller. A community." The word community slipped between us like a knife. I felt something cold bloom in my chest, a clarity sharper than pain. These were the moves of a takeover, executed with family labels for camouflage. I finished my meal slowly, deliberately, tasting every memory I had left in the flavor. When I cleared the dishes, I stacked them carefully, refused to break. Then I walked past Trevor into my study. He watched, eyes flicking over the door. I closed it behind me. In the quiet of that room, I opened my notebook and wrote until the ink bled. They will not win. The words were not angry. They were certain. The escalation had become full-blown war. Not of words, but of wills. I was too old to wait, too determined to surrender. And now, the battle had sprung into the open. By the time Saturday morning arrived, the lines had been drawn so clearly that the air between us felt like a pane of glass, clean, reflective, brittle. Trevor moved around the house with a peculiar mix of entitlement and disdain, as if he were the executor of a living estate rather than a guest in the home his grandfather still owned. He made calls without stepping into another room, paced with rehearsed urgency, and spoke with the clipped, superior tone of someone who believed they were on the cusp of inheriting a burden they never earned. I watched him from my chair by the window, the very same chair where I'd read books to his father, where I had fallen asleep listening to Gloria hum in the kitchen, where I had once felt like the center of something sacred. That morning I felt like a trespasser in my own history. He didn't greet me. Instead, he walked to the coffee pot, poured a cup, and left his empty cereal bowl on the table. "By the way," he said, "Dad talked to a lawyer. Says it might be a good idea to start the process. You know, in case things go south, I didn't ask what process. I didn't need to." He meant power of attorney. He meant adult guardianship. He meant erasure. I said nothing. He took my silence for weakness. At noon, Brian returned. He came with a folder and a forced smile. "Just a few things we'd like you to look over," he said. "Nothing binding. Just suggestions." I invited him in without warmth. We sat in the living room, me in my chair. Trevor slouched on the couch, Brian perched on the edge like a therapist preparing to break difficult news. He handed me the folder. Inside were 3 documents, a healthcare proxy, a financial power of attorney, and a document authorizing the transfer of shared access to all my major accounts. "Just in case," Brian repeated, like a lullaby meant to sedate, not soothe. I held the papers delicately, as though they might stain me. "You think I've gone soft?" I said, not looking up. "That I've lost the edge?" "Lost my reason," Brian didn't answer. Trevor shifted, crossed his arms. "We just want to help," he said, which sounded more like a threat than a comfort. I nodded slowly, folding the folder closed with a quiet snap. "And I appreciate that. But before we go any further, there's something I need to show you." I stood, walked to the small cabinet by the fireplace, and pulled out a stack of documents, everything neatly labeled, every folder a piece of my response. "This," I said, handing Brian a copy, "is a medical clearance, signed by 2 licensed specialists. It confirms I am fully competent, mentally, emotionally, cognitively. And this," I added, producing another paper, is a legally binding revocation of any prior authority, real or implied, that either of you thought you had over my affairs. Brian took the papers with slow fingers. Trevor stood indignant. What is this? Are you serious? I turned to face him fully. You tried to build a case for my incompetence, Trevor. You manipulated my routines, whispered your narrative into your father's ear, trespassed into my records, and planted a lie. A lie that ends today. Trevor's face twisted. We were trying to protect you, he shouted, his voice cracking with the fury of exposed intention. Brian stood now too, a little pale. Dad, maybe we went too far, but you have to admit, things have changed. You're not— I am still me, I interrupted, not loudly, but firmly. You judged the slowness of age as failure. But age is not decay. It is accumulation. You assumed delay was dementia. But I was watching, calculating, waiting. I walked to my desk, opened a separate drawer, and pulled out one final item. This, I said, is the revised version of my will. Trevor stepped back as if slapped. You wrote us out? He spat. After everything? I nodded once. You don't inherit from someone you tried to erase. The room went very still. The only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock, one Gloria and I had bought in our first year of marriage. Trevor stormed out first, his shoes loud on the hardwood. Brian stayed behind for a moment longer. He looked down at the floor, his voice quieter than it had been in years. Was it really that bad? He asked. I didn't answer. He already knew. When the door finally closed behind them, I returned to my chair. I sat in silence for a long time, feeling the echo of their departure settle into the air. Then I did the simplest thing I could think of. I opened my notebook, wrote the date, and underlined it 3 times. This was the day I reclaimed my life, not with violence, not with revenge, but with order, clarity, and the undeniable truth of a man who could still count. Not just dollars, not just days, but every betrayal, every insult, every moment they believed I wouldn't fight back. And I had counted them all. The house has returned to its quiet rhythm, and for the first time in months, it feels like it belongs to me again. The shoes by the door are mine. The air smells like black coffee and lemon polish, not fast food wrappers and body spray. I water the plants on the windowsill every morning, just like Gloria used to. Ahori instiu, and I sit in my chair by the front window with a book I rarely read, but always open. The silence, once heavy with loneliness, now feels like earned peace. It's not that the ache of what happened has gone, it hasn't, but it's quieter now, like an old wound that finally stops itching. After Brian and Trevor left that day, they didn't call. Not for weeks. And I didn't call them either. I expected some backlash, maybe another attempt at manipulation. But what I got was worse. Absence. A heavy, deliberate absence. Brian, I suppose, didn't know how to speak to a father who had seen through him, and Trevor, in his teenage mind, likely thought the game had simply ended in disqualification rather than disinheritance. I was not surprised. People don't always apologize when they're caught. Sometimes they retreat. Sometimes they build new stories about you in their heads, stories that make them feel better about walking away. I still had the voicemail from Brian, saved on the machine. The one where he said they just wanted to help. I played it once more before I deleted it, not out of anger, but as an act of closure. You can't hold on to something and move forward at the same time. What they never understood was that I never wanted to punish anyone. I didn't rewrite my will out of spite. I did it because clarity is a kindness. I had seen what confusion did to families, what ambiguity around money, property, and power could do to people who once loved each other. Gloria and I had witnessed it firsthand at her sister's funeral, when nieces and nephews tore each other apart over dusty jewelry boxes and insurance policies. We swore we'd never let that happen in our family. For a long time, I thought we'd succeeded. I thought love would be enough to protect us from the worst instincts of survival. But love without respect is just decoration. After the confrontation, I finalized the donations. The Veterans Fund received a substantial contribution in Gloria's name. The local library, where I used to read to children every summer, now has a scholarship program for underprivileged students, also named after her, and I left a portion to the animal shelter, where we adopted our old beagle, Daisy. It was all done legally, publicly, permanently. I didn't hide it. I didn't threaten with it. I simply acted. That was the difference. I didn't shout to be heard. I let the silence speak for me. A few neighbors noticed the change in routine. "Haven't seen your grandson around," one said. I just nodded and smiled. "He's busy growing up," I said, which was true in its way. There are moments, of course, when memory flickers. I'll walk into a room and forget what I needed. I'll search for a word and feel it just out of reach. But these are not signs of unraveling. They are signs of having lived. Age is not a breakdown. It's an archive. And if I sometimes take longer to retrieve the right file, it does not mean the system is corrupted. It means it's rich, layered, worth something. Some evenings I still imagine Trevor coming back, not with excuses, but with real questions. Not about money, about who I am, about what I remember, about the woman who made pancakes shaped like teddy bears, and the man who taught high schoolers to find logic in chaos. Maybe one day he'll want to know more. Maybe not. That's not my burden to carry anymore. What I've learned is that dignity is not something others grant you. It's something you protect, quietly and fiercely. And while the world may try to reduce you to a number, a signature, or a bed in a facility somewhere, the truth is, as long as you remember who you are never erased. So now when I count, change, pills, calendar days, I do it out loud. Not because I need to, but because it reminds me I still can. And they heard me. Every number, every word. And they will remember it longer than I'll ever need to.